When you start researching 19th century architecture, you expect certain things: construction delays, budget overruns, arguments over materials and how to do things cheaper and easier. What you don't expect is a pattern of deliberate omission so consistent it becomes impossible to ignore. My research began with a simple question about building efficiency. Why do some buildings from the 1880s and 1890s feel fundamentally wrong, despite being structurally sound and complex? Why was so much effort put into these buildings that made it more difficult to function in for the average person? Take a municipal building in Lower Manhattan constructed in 1887. Administrative offices, permit processing, tax collection. Nothing ceremonial about it. The kind of building where clerks would work 10-hour days, walking the same corridors hundreds of times. The interior doors measure nearly 4 meters tall, 13 feet. The handles are positioned at what would be chest height for someone 7 feet tall. The thresholds are raised 8 inches. Brass hardware shows decades of wear. The hinges are industrial grade, clearly designed for constant daily use. This wasn't symbolic architecture, this was functional space. But the function assumes a user who doesn't match any population demographic from that era. The average American male in 1887 was 5'7", while these doors were built for someone 18 inches taller. Similar proportions appear in working buildings across Boston, Philadelphia, Chicago, Montreal. Ground floor windows, positioned 9 feet up. Staircases with 14-inch risers. Doorways that force modern humans to reach upward just to turn the handle. Architecture is fundamentally ergonomic. You build to the body that uses the space. When buildings are designed for daily use, every measurement matters. Extra reaching creates fatigue, reduces productivity, increases injury. So why would practical administrative buildings be constructed at a scale that makes ordinary human use inefficient? A door doesn't prove anything until you realize it was built for someone who wasn't you. The architectural documentation reveals a pattern. Between 1870 and 1910, working buildings across multiple cities were constructed with nearly identical proportional anomalies. Not cathedrals, not monuments, warehouses, customs houses, train stations, municipal offices. In Boston, a commercial building from 1889 has ground floor windows that sit 9 feet above the sidewalk. No security advantage, no functional benefit. For a building housing retail operations and offices, this is counterintuitive. A postal sorting facility in Chicago, built in 1892, contains interior staircases with riser heights of 14 inches. Modern building code maxes out at 7 3/4 inches. Workers would have climbed them dozens of times per shift. Yet the building was used continuously for 40 years. No modifications, no complaints in operational records. Customs houses in Montreal and Halifax show similar patterns. Interior working doors between offices measure 11 to 13 feet. Service doors opened and closed 50 times a day. The handles sit at shoulder height for modern humans. For repetitive use, this is biomechanically inefficient. Any architect familiar with human factors engineering would have caught this in design. The architectural plans show these measurements clearly. The door heights aren't mistakes, they're specified. Someone designed these spaces intentionally at this scale. Architecture reflects its users. Hospital corridors are wide for gurneys. School desks scale to children. Buildings are tools, and tools must fit the hand that uses them. So why would functional buildings be designed for a body that doesn't match any known population from that period, unless there was a population that wasn't documented in the standard records? When you start looking for references to exceptionally tall humans in historical documents, the first surprise is how common they are. The second surprise is how matter-of-fact the reporting is. Native American oral traditions across dozens of tribes describe encounters with giant peoples, not gods, organized societies with territory and governance. The Paiute describe the Sitaka in Nevada. The Iroquois describe stone giants in the Northeast. These aren't vague legends. They include specific locations, specific conflicts, specific outcomes. Spanish colonial records from the 16th century contain multiple accounts of exceptionally tall indigenous warriors. In 1541, Francisco Vázquez de Coronado's expedition encountered warriors in northern New Mexico who measured 7 to 8 feet tall. The expedition's scribe, Pedro de Castañeda, recorded their height as a tactical detail. His descriptions weren't sensational, they were observational. Then there are the newspapers. Between 1850 and 1920, American regional newspapers regularly reported the discovery of large human skeletons. The New York Times, the San Diego Union, the Clearfield Progress, papers of record. The articles describe skeletons measuring 7, 9, sometimes 12 feet in length. They provide specific locations: burial mounds in Ohio, railway excavations in Wisconsin, farmland in Minnesota. They describe the condition: articulated skeletons, preserved tissue, bones showing healed fractures. Many articles mention that remains were sent to the Smithsonian Institution for analysis. They name the representatives who collected them. They provide transfer dates. This isn't folklore. These are logistical details. And the tone is the same as any other archaeological discovery. Height is noted as unusual but not impossible. The articles don't invoke myth or legend. The most important detail isn't that giants were reported. It's how ordinary those reports once were. The newspaper archives show something strange. From 1850 to approximately 1920, reports of giant skeleton discoveries appear regularly, multiple times per year, different states, different contexts. Then, around 1920, the reports stop almost completely. Not gradually, they simply stop appearing in mainstream publications. The last wave of these, however, include particularly detailed reports. An 1895 article describes a skeleton found in Pennsylvania measuring over 8 feet, with a jaw that could fit over the face of a modern man. It names the farm. It names the Smithsonian representative who collected it. A 1912 article describes multiple skeletons found during excavation in Wisconsin. 7 to 9 feet. Robust bone structure. The remains were crated and shipped to the Smithsonian. These articles include details that would allow verification, locations, dates, names. But when modern researchers attempt to follow up, they hit a wall. The Smithsonian has no catalog entries for these specific remains, no transfer records, no analysis reports. The bones simply aren't there. The Smithsonian's cataloging system from that era was remarkably thorough. Acquisitions were logged, origins were documented, analysis results were published. For most archaeological discoveries from that period, the paper trail is extensive. But for the giant skeleton discoveries mentioned in newspapers, there's nothing. The pattern holds across multiple institutions. University collections have no records. State historical societies have no catalog entries. Private museums that documented other unusual discoveries have nothing on the giant skeletons. The discoveries didn't stop. The reporting did. And then the physical evidence disappeared from institutional custody. When you examine construction records from the same era, another pattern emerges. Foundation stones in urban buildings from the 1880s and 1890s routinely weigh between 5 and 50 tons. What's unusual is the placement. Many of these stones sit deep inside dense urban blocks, streets too narrow for modern cranes, turning radii too tight for large trucks, overhead clearances too low for lifting rigs. Construction ledgers from this period are remarkably detailed. They record the weight of stone precisely. They note the quarry of origin. They document transportation costs. But they routinely omit one critical detail: how the stone was moved into final position. A granite foundation block in a Philadelphia office building weighs 32 tons. The ledger records the weight, the quarry, the rail transport, the delivery to the site. Then the record skips ahead. The next entry shows the stone in position, the foundation complete. No mention of rigging, no mention of equipment, no mention of crew size. For a 32-ton stone in a tight urban location, this information should be prominent. It's the most technically challenging part of the operation. But it's missing. A 50-ton cornerstone in a Boston municipal building sits in a below-grade foundation pit. The streets around it are narrow. The buildings on either side were already standing. There's no evidence of the temporary demolition that would have been required to bring in period cranes. Yet the stone is there, precisely positioned, level within a quarter inch, bearing the full weight of a 6-story building for over a century. Someone knew exactly how heavy the stone was. They documented it carefully, but they didn't write down how it moved. Supervisor diaries and construction journals from the period occasionally include references to unusual work protocols. Sites cleared in the evening. Workers dismissed early. Restricted access during certain phases. An 1889 diary from a construction supervisor in Chicago describes a 3-day period where the foundation crew was sent home at 4 p.m. instead of the usual 7 p.m. The entry notes that specialized placement would occur overnight. The next morning's entry simply states that the cornerstone was in position. No mention of who performed the placement, no mention of equipment. Another journal from an 1893 project in New York mentions that photography of the foundation work was restricted during the initial placement phase. Construction photography was common in this era. Documenting foundation work was standard practice. But for certain projects, photography was explicitly forbidden during stone placement. The restriction would lift once the foundation was complete. These restrictions don't appear in public contracts or official records. They show up in private journals and personal correspondence, documentation that wasn't meant for public review. The pattern suggests specialized crews operating outside normal documentation protocols, workers who showed up after regular crews left, equipment that wasn't logged, methods that weren't described. If the methods were conventional, they would have been documented. Stone placement techniques were well understood. Construction journals regularly publish detailed accounts of innovative rigging systems. Unless the methods weren't conventional, unless the personnel weren't conventional. When you map construction timelines for major urban buildings in the 1880s and 1890s, the numbers don't add up. Entire districts were constructed in 10 to 15 years. From groundbreaking to occupancy, buildings with stone foundations, masonry walls, intricate interior work. After the Chicago fire of 1871, the city rebuilt faster than modern construction would allow. Hundreds of substantial masonry buildings went up in less than 20 years. The Great Chicago Fire destroyed over 3 square miles. The reconstruction included new building codes and more robust construction methods. Yet the rebuild happened faster than the original construction. Construction permit records show similarly compressed timelines. A 6-story stone office building in Boston, permit issued March 1888. Occupancy November 1889. 19 months from groundbreaking to tenants moving in. Modern construction of a comparable building would take 36 months minimum, and that's with steel framing, power tools, mechanized concrete pouring. The 1889 building was hand-cut stone, hand-mixed mortar, hand-fitted joinery. The bottleneck in any masonry construction is stone placement. Each stone needs to be positioned, checked for level, mortared, and allowed to cure before the next course goes up. Yet these buildings went up fast, routinely, across multiple cities, during the same period when oversized proportions were appearing in the architecture. Either the builders had labor forces far larger than any documentation suggests, or they had physical advantages that aren't acknowledged. More workers helps, but only to a point. Stone placement speed is limited by physics, but it scales with the physical capability of the workers. If your stone masons are larger, stronger, with longer reach, placement becomes faster. Stones that require 3 modern workers can be handled by 1 worker of appropriate size. There's a word that appears consistently in maps, encyclopedias, and atlases from the 17th through mid-19th centuries: Tartaria, or Great Tartary. It refers to a large region in northern and central Asia. The references aren't vague, they're specific. Maps show borders, trade routes, cities. It appears in French maps, German maps, British maps. It's in the Encyclopedia Britannica. It's in world atlases used for navigation and trade. Then, around 1850, it starts disappearing. Not through conquest, not through political reorganization. The word simply stops appearing in new publications. By 1900, Tartaria has essentially vanished from Western cartography and reference materials. The region still exists. The geography hasn't changed, but the name and political context are gone. The strange part is how thoroughly the prior references get erased. When colonial regions changed hands, old names usually remained in historical contexts. But with Tartaria, there's very little transitional documentation. That documentation is sparse to non-existent in Western archives. The disappearance of Tartaria doesn't correlate with any major documented historical event. It just fades from the record. What makes this relevant is timing. The period when Tartaria disappears from maps overlaps with the period when oversized architecture appears in Western cities. It overlaps with newspaper reports of giant skeletons. It overlaps with the construction boom that saw entire urban districts built at unprecedented speed. If there was a population that needed to be written out of history, you'd need to remove their political context too. The maps would need to be updated. The encyclopedias would need to be revised. The geographic terminology would need to change. And that appears to be exactly what happened. Not dramatically, just gradual revision until the old references were gone. If you accept the architectural evidence, the skeletal evidence, and the documentary gaps, you need an explanation that accounts for all of it. Here's a possibility that fits. Giants weren't mythological, they were a demographic subset. Real physical humans who existed within recorded history at heights of 7 to 10 feet. And they served functional roles. The architecture makes sense if you view it through this lens. Oversized working buildings weren't monuments. They were administrative spaces designed for a specific population. The height wasn't symbolic, it was ergonomic. If you had a subpopulation capable of reaching higher, lifting more, and moving more efficiently in larger spaces, you'd build environments scaled to them for tasks where their physical advantages mattered, oversight roles, administrative positions, construction work. This explains the uniformity of proportions across regions. The buildings weren't built to intimidate. They were built to accommodate a workforce that existed across multiple cities during the same period. It explains why the proportions appear in working buildings rather than ceremonial spaces. These weren't symbols, these were tools. Office buildings, customs houses, warehouses. It explains the construction speed. If your foundation crews included workers who could move heavier stones with less rigging, the bottleneck would be reduced. Placement becomes faster. Timelines compress. It explains the documentation gaps. If this population was being systematically erased from the historical record, you'd need to obscure their role in infrastructure development. Better to omit the details. Better to restrict photography. And it explains the skeletal evidence disappearing from institutional custody if remains keep appearing that validate the existence of this population. Those remains become problematic. They contradict the revised historical narrative. Once you scale the building to the body, the mystery disappears. The doors make sense, the stairs make sense, the windows, the foundations, the construction timelines, all of it makes sense. Erasure doesn't require conspiracy. It requires indifference, bureaucratic inertia, and the passage of time. Evidence doesn't need to be destroyed. It just needs to be miscatalogued. Bones get logged under the wrong accession number. They sit in storage, technically preserved, but effectively inaccessible. Decades pass. The original paperwork gets lost. Eventually, no one knows what's in that box. Photographs don't need to be burned, they just need to not be digitized. Physical prints sit in a filing cabinet, the building gets renovated. The cabinet goes into off-site storage. Access becomes inconvenient. Eventually, the photographs exist in a catalog, but nobody's seen them in 50 years. Documents don't need to be censored, they just need to not be indexed. A construction journal sits in a historical society's collection. It's preserved, but it's not searchable. Unless you're already looking for evidence of what it contains, you'd never find it. This is how institutional memory fades. The evidence remains. But practical access requires knowing exactly what you're looking for and where it might be stored. Add natural turnover of institutional staff. The curator who knew about unusual remains retires. The new curator doesn't know the collection. After a few staff changes, the institutional knowledge is gone. Now add intentional gatekeeping. Not dramatic, just individual decisions. A researcher requests access to unusual skeletal remains. The request sits on someone's desk. It gets marked low priority. It takes months to process. The researcher moves on. Over decades, these small barriers accumulate. Evidence becomes hard to access, then harder, then effectively impossible. Institutions don't need to lie. They just need to stop asking questions. They need to stop prioritizing certain types of research. They need to stop making certain materials easily accessible. Archives burn. Floods destroy documents. Bones get lost in storage. Photographs degrade. Institutional memory fades. But cities remain. The streets keep their turning radii. The alleys keep their width. Foundations keep their depth and their weight. Stones that shouldn't be where they are stay where they are. Doors stay the height they were built. Handles stay positioned where they were installed. Every day, thousands of people interact with these architectural features and unconsciously adjust. They reach higher than feels natural. They step over awkward thresholds. They accept the inconvenience because the building is old. But they're not odd randomly. The oddness has a pattern. The proportions repeat across buildings from the same era in different cities. The measurements cluster around specific ratios that don't match the documented population from that period. You can erase records, you can lose bones, you can restrict photographs, but you can't erase geometry. So the buildings remain increasingly strange as modern humans get further from, whatever population they were originally designed for. The doors get taller relative to the people using them. The stairs get more awkward. The windows drift further above comfortable sight lines. Each building is a frozen record of the bodies that built it and used it. Whatever assumptions went into the original design are still there, embedded in stone and mortar. This is why the architectural evidence matters more than any document. Documents can be removed from circulation. Photographs can be kept out of catalogs. Bones can be stored in inaccessible locations. But a door that's been in place for 130 years isn't going anywhere. You can ignore it, you can choose not to measure it, but it's still there. Still the wrong height, still forcing everyone who uses it to adjust to a scale that doesn't match them. The archive that can't be burned is the city itself. The measurements are permanent. Anyone with a tape measure can verify them. You can erase records. You can't erase geometry. Research begins with measurement, not belief, not theory. Measurement. Go to an old building, not a cathedral, a municipal building, a train station, a commercial structure from 1880 to 1910. Bring a tape measure. Measure the door heights, measure the windowsills, measure the stair risers. Write down the numbers. Then compare those numbers to modern building codes. Compare them to historical codes from the same era. Compare them to the documented average height of humans from that period. Watch for the pattern. Watch for the consistent proportional relationships that don't align with the population that supposedly built them. The doors are still there. The measurements don't change. The geometry doesn't lie. The giants didn't vanish. They were written out, and the buildings never forgot them.